Hi everyone, in this video I want to talk about some of the ways you can respond to texts. As I've mentioned in the historical fiction videos, for us to teach social studies, we have to integrate with language arts. Here are some ways that we can respond to social studies based content in ways that will also help students meet language arts standards in reading, writing, and potentially in the other language arts as well. And so our goals here are to define what a text is, and to just explain some of the steps and strategies that we are using to respond to them in our classrooms. Some of these might be new to you and some of them might not be. Feel free for any that I go over here to you. These are all very common. Some of them are newer, some of them I should say are older. You can Google them and find out more information about anything you want to find more information about, including some examples. So first, I want to just mention what I'm considering a text here in this course. For our purposes, it's going to be anything that conveys information. So it could be a traditional written text, like a textbook. Textbooks are still used in elementary social studies, less so than they were, 20 years ago, but they are still used. I know I had a student in a field experience last year, I think it was actually, who was in a field experience an hour or so away from here in Bemidji, and she talked about that they use textbooks in their classroom. It could also be it could be picture books, it could be trade books. Trade books are just nonfiction books that deal with topics related to social studies. It could be historical fiction, it could be a web page, it could be an article, it could be a newspaper. So it could be any sort of traditional written thing in different formats. It could also be, though, a video or a song or a performance in some cases. Not all of these strategies are going to work with all of these things, but some of them will work with multiple ones. So the first thing I want to mention is something that I would do with upper elementary and middle school students and above. I would not do this with primary age students, but it's called a dialectical journal. Sometimes it's called a double entry journal. Business teachers don't like that because a double entry journal means something very specific in business. And you simply take a piece of paper and you make a hot dog fold. You fold it in half lengthwise as if you were making a hot dog bun. And then on the left-hand side of the paper, students write several of the most important passages from the text. And if I were first doing this, I would probably choose these myself. I might say, I have picked the 3 most important phrases or the 2 most important passages from what I want you to read. And then what I want you to do is, as you read or after you read, I want you to respond to each of those passages. And then over time, you might then scaffold this. So students, after they've done that a couple times, then you might say, I've chosen one passage. I would like for you to choose 1 or 2 passages. And then finally, students can get to the point where they can choose all of the important passages themselves, which is important because different students are going to gravitate to different things that are important to them. So the left-hand side are the passages, and then corresponding straight across on the right-hand side is the student's response. And if the passage is complex, I'm just going to have students explain it in their own words. But if the passage is relatively simple, and I know the students can understand it, I know they comprehend it, then I want to go to higher level questions than comprehension. Why was this passage important to you? What about it made sense? What about it's confusing? Why is it important? What connections can you make between it and other learning that you've had? So here is an example that is probably challenging for you to see. This is not a social studies example, it's a language arts example, and this is from a high school freshman. So obviously you're going to have simpler examples and simpler responses typically in an upper elementary or middle school environment. Another possibility, somewhat traditional, it's been around for a very long time, are literature circles. Literature circles are groups of 3 to 5 students reading the same self-selected text. So, for example, in my in-person class, because it's structured a little bit differently than the online class, I have students, in addition to Survivors in the Birch Bark House, students have to choose a historical fiction text of their own choice. And students then engage in that in literature circles of a sort. Now, at the start, you're going to read aloud from each of the possibilities. You ask for students maybe to make predictions about what happens next in the story, and then you move on to the next book. So you are previewing the books for your students to choose from. And then in groups, we know for groups to be effective, every group member has to be given a specific task. So if we have a group of 4 students, we might have one be the recorder, one might be the timekeeper, one might be the encourager, and one might be the facilitator. And you have students read a certain number of chapters. Chapters are often better than pages because different books will have different page ranges, right? And then meet as a group. This might need to vary too from book to book. And they will discuss it after every so many chapters. And then at the end, a culminating activity of some sort. Make a play about the book, write a review of it, make a diorama, interview characters in the book, and so on. SQ3R is a very traditional approach, and it's generally used with textbooks. It can be used with other materials as long as it has subheadings. And so in SQ3R, the S stands for survey, and survey is simply skimming. You are skimming the selection. You might be looking at the pictures, looking at the maps. You might glance through the introductory paragraph and the conclusion as well. And then the Q, you are going to make questions, formulate questions by taking each subheading or each heading in the selection and turn it into a question. So, for example, if the subheading is crops of the Southeast United States, your question might be a very simple lower level one. What are crops of the Southeastern United States? That's entirely appropriate here. And then you read to answer the questions. This helps students set a purpose for reading. Now, ideally, a purpose for reading is going to be intrinsic. It's going to be within the student. But in practice, when we're reading content, that purpose is for students to get through the contents, for them to learn things. And so it's going to be maybe less intrinsic than other reading encounters are. And this helps students learn to set a purpose. It gives them a purpose to read. It will aid their comprehension if they have a purpose while they read. Then after reading, you are going to recite the answers to the questions. In other words, you're going to answer each question. And you're typically going to answer it on paper, despite the word recite. And then you're going to review, do my answers make sense? This is a very traditional approach. I did this in school. Several years ago now, I was cleaning out my dad's home, and I came across a paper that was just in a box of random stuff from when I was in, and the papers when I was in 4th grade, which would have been like 1982, give or take a couple of years. And there was an SQ3R that 9-year-old Carl did. Very traditional, but it does do things that are important, like help students set a purpose for reading. Literature response journals are newer, but they've still been around for a very long time. Students write reactions as they read. They respond to what they're reading. So here we're specifically talking about literature. You could do something similar potentially with nonfiction. It kind of depends how it's structured. And then you leave space for you as the teacher to respond to their responses. So it's a little bit of back and forth. Now, I know you're going to have 25 students. No one expects you to respond to all 25 students each day. For any sort of journal, you're going to collect them and you're going to respond to a certain number each day, maybe 5 students each night. You can probably do that in 10 minutes. Maybe you'll do 7 students each night, so you don't have to do it on Friday night, right? So whatever works. Now, I want to point this out, and please listen to this. Please take this with you. You have to read journals. If you assign journals to students, you must review them. You don't have to read them word for word. You don't have to go into great detail or anything, but you have to review them. Because if students reveal anything in their journals that might provide suspicion that they have been the victim of abuse or neglect over the past 3 years, you are a mandatory reporter. You must report it. And there have been teachers, this happened in another state, but there have been teachers who did not report things they read in students' journals. So a tragedy happened, and the police then started to investigate the teacher. In one case, the teacher agreed to give up their teaching license in exchange for charges being dropped. You are a required reporter. If you see evidence in a journal entry, even if it's about even if it's about fiction, and the student says something like, "Oh, this reminds me of something that happened to me. Last year, blah, blah, blah. You have to report that. You are not an investigator. You do not investigate it, but you must report it. Where you report it varies a little bit. If you think the student is in immediate jeopardy, you call 911. Otherwise, you call the appropriate child services agency for your community. If you're not sure where to report it, ask someone in your building, ask your principal, ask a counselor, ask another teacher. It is not enough for you to report a suspicion to someone at your school. If you have a suspicion, you must report it to authorities. Now, if it were me, I would tell my principal or whoever, hey, I found this out about so-and-so, I need to report it. And if it's my first time, I'm going to ask, where do I call? Like, where do I go? Because it's typically a local thing, community level or county level. But again, it's not enough for you just to tell the principal. Even the principal says to me, oh, Carl, thanks for letting me know. I'll take care of it. This is in addition to the child's needs, this is my teaching license. This is my job. This is my duty. I am still going to report it. You must. It is law. It is law in all 50 states as well as other U.S. territories like D.C. And that includes not just personal journals that students write, but in something like a literature response journal. So you need to read it because you need to at least skim it so that you can report if you need to. And remember, in reporting, you do not investigate. You are not an investigator. You're not trained for that. You simply say, this is what I saw. I suspect that there is abuse, or I suspect that there is neglect, or that there was in the past 3 years. And as a required reporter, I am reporting this. All right. QAR is another very traditional approach. QAR stands for question, answer, reflect. Students develop questions as they read. They then seek answers. Again, we're setting a purpose for reading. And then at the end, they reflect on their answers. They review their answers. 3-2-1, I occasionally do this in classes. I may occasionally do this in this class. Those of you who've had me, if you've had me in the past for like 3417, is that the number? For teaching and learning in the middle school. Anyway, that is something I commonly do in that class. This is after you've read something, 3 big ideas from it, 2 connections that connect to something else you've learned or done or experienced, and 1 question. And this just helps people assimilate new information into their schemata. Raft is a writing strategy. It helps students write to a specific audience. And each letter in Raft, of course, stands for something. R is the role of the writer. A is the audience. F is the format. T is the topic. So here, the writers aren't the students themselves. They're adopting new personae, new masks. And so they are saying something like, oh, I am a character who has witnessed what's going on in Number the Stars. And I'm going to interview Anne-Marie, or I'm going to interview someone else. I'm going to interview Kirsten. Was that? I can't remember if Kirsten or Kirsty was her sister, but I'm going to interview this person or that person. That's my role. My audience, oh, I'm interviewing them for blah, blah, blah. And my format, maybe it's an interview, like I just said here. Maybe your format's a poem. Maybe your format is a letter to the editor in a different context. And then obviously T is your topic. Another approach that's commonly used in high school and middle school are Cornell notes. These are often used for lectures, but they could also be used for reading. And I might do these occasionally in, say, 5th grade or 6th grade. Obviously, 6th grade is typically middle school. So here you hot dog fold a paper into thirds, and you section off the bottom third of the paper. And so I'm going to just draw this on here, a picture of paper that's been sectioned off into thirds. So, whoops, that is not a pen. That is a laser pointer. Try that again. And we'll just do regular color. All right. So here's my paper. And so first I section it into thirds. Pretend these are thirds. I know they aren't even. And then I take the bottom third, or maybe the bottom fourth, and I section that off. My notes go here in the center and write. And this 2/3 here is where my notes go. After I'm done taking notes, I go back, and as I go through my notes, I come up with questions that my notes answer. And I have, no matter what computer I use, PowerPoint always makes these artifacts, and I don't know why. So this first question would go with the first part of my notes. The second question would go with the second part. The third question would go with the third part, and so on. At the very bottom of the paper is where my notes are going to be summarized. So having questions next to the notes helps students use these as self-tests. The bottom third helps students go back and review notes really quickly to see, do I know this information or not? Do I remember it? This is really beneficial in high school where students might take lots of notes. And again, these could be notes from reading as well as notes from lecture. I will say that when I taught 5th grade, one thing I did was at the end of this, near the end of this year, in the last 9 weeks, I did start lecturing to my 5th graders. And I did it very specifically because I wanted to prepare them for middle school, where especially at that time, they were going to be lectured to much more often. And one thing I found that I thought was really interesting, that I think sometimes gets overlooked in the research that says, oh, no, don't lecture, is that a lot of my students responded really well to lecture, including my students who struggled with reading, because reading the textbook was a struggle for them, but their listening comprehension was high. And so having me lecture and having them take, simple notes over a 10-minute lecture or maybe even a 15-minute lecture was something that they were actually, they could be successful at in a way that was less cognitively demanding for some of my students than reading the textbook was. And so I thought that was really interesting. I would obviously not overuse lecture, but I'm not opposed to it, even in the upper grades in elementary school. You are free to disagree with me, of course. This is one you're probably familiar with, KWL. I like KWLS. There are other versions of it as well. This is often used for research projects. The K is what I know, the W is what I want to learn, and then after the research or after the reading, what did I learn? Then the S is what I still need to find out. Some formats of this include an H after what I want to learn, and the H is how am I going to learn? How am I going to find this information? That could also be beneficial. So obviously in a KWLS, or KWL traditional without the S, you are probably going to start by modeling this as a whole class project. You might have students then move to doing it in groups before you have students do it individually. And then a language experience approach. This is something that is typically done with non-readers, or with emergent readers. So this is often done in kindergarten, first grade, but it also works well with students who have learning disabilities and for students who are learning English. After some sort of shared experience, this is traditionally a field trip, but it could be something like a read aloud. The class writes about the experience together, with you as the teacher scribing it. And traditionally you would scribe it on a big piece of chart paper, but you could do it on a computer as well, I think. And then after you scribe it, you create texts from what you have scribed. So with chart paper, you would cut the chart paper apart into sentences. You might recopy them onto sentence strips. Obviously, if you are typing it as students talk, it's easier to do some of this stuff on the computer. And then students can read those texts, and they can read them relatively easily, because they're things that they wrote themselves. They are fairly short. And as you scribe, before you cut things apart, you are going to read it chorally with the class multiple times. And so lots of students are just going to memorize it, which is great. They've read something. It may not be reading from our perspective, but it's something that students can be successful at, which is important. And then finally, another very traditional approach you can Google for more information is a directed reading thinking activity, or DRTA. There's also a listening version called a DLTA, directed listening thinking activity. Here you break text into natural stopping points. And so for the directed part, you first activate students' background knowledge. You help students make predictions with open-ended questions. You then have students scan headings and subheadings and illustrations before they read. And then as students read, again, you have pre-assigned stopping points. And when students get to the stopping point, you as the teacher pose questions. So you might be having students read with you in a small group. You might have students read independently and answer the questions independently. You might have students read independent, might have everyone read and do something else until everyone is done to come together to answer the questions. There's different ways you can approach it. And then at the end of each section, students self-assess their predictions and they make new ones or they revise the ones that they made. So up on D2L for the PowerPoint for this, the final slide is on vocabulary. I want to talk more about vocabulary in more depth, so I'm not going to include that in this video for the sake of time. But we're going to come back to vocabulary at some point in the course later on. But you can take a look at that. You can preview that slide on the presentation on D2L if you want. If you have any questions, please let me know. I hope you found this useful, and thanks for watching.